What happens when power meets prejudice at 30,000 feet, and a father's love becomes the only weapon strong enough to shatter the walls of injustice? This is not just a story about fame. This is about dignity, family, and the moment when silence becomes impossible. Los Angeles International Airport, Terminal 7, 6:45 in the morning. The California sun barely breaking through the tinted glass windows, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. The air smelled of coffee, expensive perfume, and that particular tension that comes with early morning flights. Lori Harvey stood at the first-class check-in counter, her carry-on bag resting beside her designer heels, her boarding pass clutched in perfectly manicured fingers. She wore a cream cashmere sweater, dark jeans and sunglasses perched on her head despite the dim morning light. She looked every bit the successful model and entrepreneur she had become, confident but not arrogant, present but not demanding attention. The woman behind the counter, Patricia Mendez, had worked for the airline for 11 years. She prided herself on professionalism, on following protocol, on maintaining order in a world that often felt chaotic. Her uniform was pressed, her hair pulled back in a tight bun, her expression neutral in that practiced way service workers learn to wear like armor. But something in her eyes, something small and sharp, flickered when Lori approached. It was subtle, the kind of thing most people would miss, but Lori had learned to recognize it. She had seen it before, in boutiques, in restaurants, in places where her face should have opened doors but instead seemed to close them. Lori handed over her passport and boarding pass with a polite smile. Patricia took them without returning the gesture. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with mechanical precision, her eyes scanning the screen, then flicking back to Lori, then back to the screen. The seconds stretched. Behind Lori, the line was growing. A businessman in a navy suit checked his watch. A mother with 2 small children shifted her weight from foot to foot. The air conditioning hummed overhead, cold and indifferent. Patricia's lips pressed into a thin line. She looked up, her gaze meeting Lori's with a hardness that felt deliberate. "There is a problem with your ticket," she said. Her voice was flat, offering no explanation, no apology. Lori blinked, confusion crossing her face. "A problem? I booked this weeks ago. Everything was confirmed yesterday." Patricia did not respond immediately. She picked up a phone, dialed an extension, spoke in a low voice that Lori could not quite hear. When she hung up, she folded her hands on the counter and said, "You will need to step aside. We are investigating an issue with your reservation." Lori felt her stomach tighten. She glanced around, suddenly aware of the eyes on her, the way the businessman behind her sighed loudly, the way the mother whispered something to her children. She stepped to the side as instructed, her heart beginning to race, not with fear, but with a creeping sense of humiliation. Minutes passed, then 10, then 15. No one came to explain. No one offered clarity. Patricia continued checking in other passengers, her movements efficient, her face blank. Lori stood there, invisible and yet hypervisible, caught in a liminal space where she was neither passenger nor person, just an inconvenience, a disruption, a problem to be managed. Another staff member arrived, a man in his 40s with graying hair and a badge that read Supervisor. His name was Richard Calloway, and he carried himself with the kind of authority that comes from years of making decisions without being questioned. He approached Lori with his hands clasped behind his back, his expression serious. "Miss, we have reason to believe there may be fraudulent activity associated with your booking." Lori stared at him, disbelief washing over her like cold water. "Fraudulent activity? I purchased this ticket myself. I can show you my confirmation email, my credit card statement, anything you need." Richard did not look at her phone when she pulled it out. He did not ask for proof. Instead, he said, "We are going to need you to come with us for further verification." His tone left no room for negotiation. Lori felt her hands begin to tremble, not from fear, but from anger, from the suffocating realization that this was not about her ticket at all. This was about something else, something uglier, something she had spent her entire life navigating. She wanted to scream. She wanted to demand answers. But she had been raised to be composed, to be graceful under pressure, to never give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. She followed Richard through a side door, down a narrow hallway lined with flickering fluorescent lights, into a small windowless room with a metal table and 2 plastic chairs. The door closed behind her with a heavy click. She sat down, her purse in her lap, her phone clutched in her hand. Richard stood by the door, arms crossed, watching her like she was a suspect rather than a paying customer. The minutes dragged. The room smelled of stale air and disinfectant. Laurie checked the time. Her flight was boarding in 30 minutes. She thought about calling her father. She hesitated. Steve Harvey was in New York preparing for a taping. He had enough on his plate. She did not want to be the daughter who always needed rescuing. But as the minutes ticked by and no one came to explain, no one came to apologize, she realized this was not something she could handle alone. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a message, and she was tired of receiving it in silence. She unlocked her phone and typed a message. "Dad, I am at LAX. They are holding me. They say my ticket is fraudulent. I do not know what to do." She hit send and waited, her heart pounding in her chest, her eyes fixed on the door, wondering if anyone would believe her, wondering if it even mattered. Outside that room, the airport continued its rhythm. Planes took off and landed. Passengers rushed to gates. Announcements echoed through the terminals, but inside that small, cold space, time stood still. And Laurie Harvey, daughter of one of the most recognizable men in America, sat alone, stripped of her name, her success, her dignity, reduced to nothing more than a question mark in someone else's system. Hey, if this story is hitting you right now, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button. Drop a comment below, even just an emoji, so I know you are here with me. And please click that hype button because it genuinely helps this channel reach more people who need to hear stories like this. Your support means everything. Now let us keep going. Across the country, in a Manhattan hotel suite overlooking Central Park, Steve Harvey was reviewing notes for his show when his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, saw Laurie's name, and felt his chest tighten before he even read the words. He had learned long ago that a text from his daughter at an unusual hour rarely brought good news. But when he read the message, something inside him shifted. Not panic, not fear. Something colder, something sharper. A clarity that comes when love meets injustice and decides it will not be silent. He stood up, his notes forgotten, and dialed her number. It rang once, twice, 3 times. No answer. He tried again. Still nothing. His jaw clenched. He called his assistant, his voice calm but firm. "Get me on the next flight to Los Angeles. I do not care what it costs. Cancel everything today. I need to be there now." Within minutes, arrangements were made. A car was waiting downstairs. His team moved with the efficiency of people who knew better than to ask questions when Steve Harvey spoke in that tone. As the car sped toward the airport, Steve stared out the window, his mind racing. He thought about all the times Laurie had faced this kind of treatment, the subtle and not so subtle ways the world tried to diminish her, to make her feel small. He thought about the conversations they had had, the advice he had given, the strength she had shown. But this was different. This was not a rude comment or a dismissive glance. This was institutional. This was calculated, and it was happening to his daughter while he was thousands of miles away. He arrived at JFK, bypassed the usual lines with the help of airline staff who recognized him immediately, and boarded a flight that would get him to Los Angeles in just over 5 hours. He did not sleep. He did not eat. He sat in his seat, his phone in his hand, checking for messages, for updates, for anything that would tell him Laurie was okay. But there was nothing. Just silence. And silence, he knew, was often the loudest scream. Back at LAX, Laurie sat in that room for over an hour. No one came to update her. No one offered water. No one acknowledged her existence beyond the occasional glance through the small window in the door. Her flight had long since departed. She had missed it. And still no explanation. She felt the tears building behind her eyes, hot and insistent, but she refused to let them fall. She would not give them that. She would not break. Finally, the door opened. Richard stepped in, his expression unchanged. "We have completed our investigation," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "You are free to go." Laurie stared at him, her mouth slightly open, disbelief and rage warring inside her. "Free to go? That is it? No apology? No explanation? Richard shrugged. Your ticket has been validated. You can rebook your flight at the counter. And then he turned and walked out, leaving the door open behind him, as if she had never been there at all. Laurie stood slowly, her legs unsteady, her hands shaking. She walked back through the hallway, back into the terminal, back into the noise and light and movement of the airport. But everything felt different now. The world had not changed. She had. Something inside her had cracked. Not broken, but cracked. And through that crack a new kind of anger was seeping in. Not the hot, explosive kind. The cold, determined kind. The kind that does not forget. She walked to the main terminal, her phone buzzing in her hand. Messages from friends, from her publicist, from her father. She opened Steve's message. I am on my way. Do not move. I will be there soon. She exhaled, a long, shaky breath, and sat down on a bench near the window, watching planes take off into the bright California sky, waiting for the one person who had never, not once, let her face the world alone. Steve Harvey's plane touched down at Los Angeles International Airport at 2:30 in the afternoon. The cabin doors opened, and he was the first one off, moving with a purpose that made people instinctively step aside. He wore a dark suit, his signature style, but there was nothing polished about his demeanor now. His face was set in stone, his eyes focused, his stride long and deliberate. He had made calls during the flight, spoken to lawyers, to contacts, to people who owed him favors. By the time his feet hit the ground in Los Angeles, he knew exactly where his daughter had been held, who had made the decision, and what he was going to do about it. He did not stop for photos. He did not acknowledge the passengers who recognized him, the ones who whispered his name or pulled out their phones. His security team flanked him, but he barely noticed them. All he could think about was Laurie, sitting somewhere in this massive airport, alone, humiliated, waiting. He had texted her from the plane. She had responded with her location. Terminal 7, main seating area near Gate 42. He moved through the airport like a man on a mission, his jaw tight, his hands clenched at his sides. When he finally saw her sitting on that bench with her bag beside her, her head down, her shoulders curved inward in a way that made her look smaller than she was, something inside him broke. Not his resolve. His restraint. He walked up to her, and she looked up, her eyes red-rimmed but dry, her face a mask of exhausted composure. "Dad," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He did not say anything. He just pulled her into his arms, holding her tight, his hand on the back of her head, and for a moment the entire airport faded away. It was just the two of them, father and daughter, and the unspoken understanding that she did not have to explain, did not have to justify, did not have to be strong anymore. When he finally pulled back, he looked into her eyes and said, "Tell me everything." And she did. She told him about Patricia at the counter, about the way she had been dismissed, about Richard and the windowless room, about the hour of silence and the cold, emotionless release. She told him about the missed flight, the lack of apology, the way they had treated her like she was nothing. Steve listened, his expression growing darker with every word, his hands curling into fists and then releasing over and over a physical manifestation of the rage he was keeping in check. When she finished, he nodded slowly. "Okay," he said. "Okay, you stay here. I will be right back." Laurie grabbed his arm. "Dad, do not make a scene, please. I just want to go home." He looked at her, and his expression softened, but only slightly. "Baby," he said, his voice low and steady, "this is not about making a scene. This is about making sure this never happens to you again, or to anyone else." He kissed her forehead, told his security to stay with her, and then turned and walked toward the airline's customer service desk with the kind of calm that precedes a storm. The customer service area was busy, a long counter with multiple agents helping frustrated travelers. Steve walked past the line, past the people waiting, straight to the desk. "Excuse me," a woman in line called out. "There is a line." Steve did not turn around. He placed both hands on the counter and looked at the agent in front of him, a young man named Daniel, who looked up with a practiced smile that faltered the moment he recognized who was standing there. "I need to speak to your supervisor," Steve said. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. It carried weight, authority, and an unmistakable edge. Daniel stammered. "Sir, if you could just wait in line, I can help you when it is your turn." Steve leaned forward slightly. "I'm not asking, son. Get me your supervisor. Now." Daniel picked up the phone, his hands shaking slightly, and within 2 minutes a woman in a navy blazer appeared. Her name was Karen Delgado, and she was the terminal manager, a position she had held for 6 years. She approached Steve with a professional smile, her hands folded in front of her. "Mr. Harvey, how can I assist you today?" Steve did not return the smile. "My daughter was detained by your staff this morning. She was held in a room for over an hour, accused of fraudulent activity with no evidence, no explanation, and no apology. She missed her flight, and I want to know why." Karen's smile tightened. "I am sure there was a misunderstanding. If you could provide me with her name and booking information, I would be happy to look into it." Steve pulled out his phone, showed her Laurie's booking confirmation, her ID, everything. Karen took the phone, her eyes scanning the screen, and then she excused herself, disappearing into a back office. Steve stood there, his arms crossed, his presence drawing the attention of everyone in the area. People whispered. Phones came out. Videos started recording. He did not care. Let them watch. Let them see what happens when you treat people like they do not matter. Karen returned 10 minutes later, and this time her expression was different, more guarded, more careful. "Mr. Harvey, I have reviewed the incident. It appears there was a routine security check that was conducted according to our protocol. Your daughter was released as soon as the verification was complete." Steve stared at her, his eyes narrowing. "Routine? You call holding someone in a room for over an hour without explanation routine? You call accusing a paying customer of fraud without evidence routine?" Karen shifted her weight. "We take security very seriously, Mr. Harvey. I'm sure you understand." Steve took a step closer, his voice dropping to a tone that was somehow more intimidating than if he had yelled. "What I understand is that my daughter was profiled. What I understand is that your staff saw a young black woman and decided she did not belong in first class. What I understand is that you are standing here trying to justify the unjustifiable." The area around them had gone quiet. Other passengers were watching now, some nodding in agreement, others recording on their phones. Karen's face flushed. "Mr. Harvey, I assure you this airline does not tolerate discrimination of any kind." Steve laughed, a short, bitter sound. "You do not tolerate it? Then why did it happen? Why is my daughter sitting over there, traumatized, humiliated, because your staff decided she was guilty before she even opened her mouth?" Karen opened her mouth to respond, but Steve held up a hand. "I do not want to hear excuses. I want accountability. I want the names of every staff member involved. I want a formal apology, and I want to make sure this never happens to anyone else." Karen hesitated, clearly weighing her options, calculating the risk of pushing back against someone with Steve Harvey's platform, his reach, his influence. Finally, she nodded. "I will personally investigate this matter and ensure that appropriate action is taken." Steve shook his head. "Not good enough. I want it in writing. I want a public statement, and I want it today." Karen swallowed hard. "I will need to consult with our corporate office." Steve pulled out his phone. "You do that. And while you're at it, you should know that this conversation is being recorded. And if I do not see real change, real accountability, then the next conversation will be with my lawyers and every media outlet that will listen." He turned and walked away, leaving Karen standing there, her face pale, her hands trembling slightly. He returned to Laurie, who was still sitting on the bench, watching him with wide eyes. "What did you do?" she asked. He sat down beside her, taking her hand. "What I should have done the moment you texted me. I made sure they know you matter, that you are not invisible, that you are not alone." Laurie leaned her head on his shoulder, and for the first time since that morning, she felt the tightness in her chest begin to ease. But Steve was not done. He pulled out his phone and opened his social media. He typed quickly, his thumbs moving with purpose. "Today my daughter was detained at LAX, accused of fraud, held without explanation, and treated like a criminal. Not because she did anything wrong, but because someone decided she did not look like she belonged. This is unacceptable. This is the reality too many people face every day. And it ends now. He attached a photo of Laurie, smiling, confident, beautiful. He hit post. Within minutes, the responses started pouring in, thousands. Then tens of thousands. Support, outrage, shared stories of similar experiences. The post went viral, spreading across platforms, igniting conversations, forcing people to pay attention. The airline's corporate office saw it. The media saw it. And suddenly, what had been a quiet, contained incident became a national story. News outlets picked it up. Reporters reached out. The airline issued a statement, vague and defensive, promising an investigation. But Steve was not satisfied with statements. He wanted action. He wanted change. And he was not going to stop until he got it. As the sun began to set over Los Angeles, casting the airport in shades of orange and gold, Steve and Laurie sat together, waiting for the next available flight. They did not talk much. They did not need to. Sometimes love is not about words. It is about showing up. It is about standing between the people you love and the world that tries to break them. It is about saying, not on my watch, not ever. And in that moment, in that airport, surrounded by strangers and cameras and the hum of a world that kept moving, Steve Harvey made a promise, not just to his daughter, but to every person who had ever been made to feel less than, who had ever been judged by the color of their skin, who had ever been told they did not belong. He promised that their voices would be heard, that their stories would matter, that they would not be forgotten. The next morning, the story had exploded beyond anything Steve could have anticipated. Every major news network was covering it. CNN, NBC, ABC, Fox, they all led with the same headline variations. Steve Harvey's daughter detained at LAX. Airline faces backlash over alleged racial profiling. The footage that passengers had recorded, shaky phone videos of Steve confronting the terminal manager, had been shared millions of times. The comment sections were flooded. Some people defended the airline, claiming security protocols were necessary. But the overwhelming majority stood with Laurie, sharing their own stories of being profiled, of being treated as suspects in spaces where they had every right to be. Steve woke up in his Los Angeles home, Laurie asleep in the guest room down the hall. He had barely slept, his mind racing with strategy, with next steps, with the weight of what this moment meant. He made coffee in the kitchen, the house quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic on Sunset Boulevard. His phone had not stopped buzzing since he posted. Messages from friends, from colleagues, from people he had not spoken to in years, all expressing support, all asking what they could do to help. But there were other messages too. Threats. Ugly, hateful words from people who saw his advocacy as an attack, who felt threatened by his refusal to stay silent. He deleted those without reading past the first line. He had learned long ago that hate was often just fear wearing a different mask. What mattered was not the voices trying to tear him down. What mattered was the voices he was lifting up. He opened his laptop and began drafting a statement, something more detailed than the social media post, something that would lay out exactly what had happened and what he expected to happen next. He wrote about Laurie's experience, about the systemic issues that allowed such treatment to occur, about the responsibility of corporations to do better, to be better. He wrote with precision, with passion, with the clarity of someone who had spent decades navigating a world that often did not want him to succeed. By 9 in the morning, his publicist had reviewed the statement and sent it to every major outlet. By 10, it was being read on live television. By 11, the airline's stock had dropped 2%, and their corporate communications team was in full crisis mode. Steve watched it all unfold from his living room, his coffee growing cold in his hand, a grim satisfaction settling in his chest. This was not about revenge, this was about accountability. This was about making sure that the next young woman, the next young man, the next person who did not fit someone's narrow idea of who belonged where, would not have to endure what Laurie had endured. Laurie emerged from the guest room around noon, her hair pulled back, wearing one of Steve's old hoodies that swallowed her frame. She looked younger like this, more vulnerable, and it reminded Steve of when she was a little girl, when the world's cruelties were still abstract concepts rather than lived experiences. She sat down beside him on the couch, tucking her legs under her. "Have you seen the news?" she asked. He nodded, all of it. She was quiet for a moment, staring at the television where a panel of commentators debated the incident, some defending her, some questioning whether she had been too sensitive, whether this was really about race or just an unfortunate misunderstanding. Laurie's jaw tightened. "They are acting like I made this up, like I wanted this to happen." Steve turned off the television. "You know the truth. I know the truth. And millions of people know the truth. The rest does not matter." But Laurie shook her head. "It does matter, Dad. Because this is what always happens. Something terrible occurs, people get outraged for a few days, and then everyone moves on. Nothing changes." Steve reached over and took her hand. "Not this time. This time we are going to make sure something changes. I promise you that." That afternoon, Steve's legal team arrived at the house. 3 lawyers, sharp and experienced, specialists in civil rights and corporate accountability. They sat around the dining room table, laptops open, documents spread out, and began building a case, not just against the individual staff members, though they would be held accountable, but against the airline itself, against the policies and training programs that allowed such behavior to flourish. They talked about discrimination lawsuits, about public pressure campaigns, about leveraging Steve's platform to force systemic reform. Laurie sat in on the meeting, listening, contributing when asked, her initial hesitation giving way to a steely determination. One of the lawyers, a woman named Angela Reeves, who had spent 20 years fighting discrimination cases, looked at Laurie with a mixture of sympathy and respect. "What happened to you was wrong, unacceptable, but you have something most victims do not have. You have a voice that people will listen to. You have a father who will not let this go. And you have the courage to stand up and say, this will not stand. We can make a real difference here, not just for you, for everyone who comes after you." Laurie nodded slowly, the weight of that responsibility settling on her shoulders. "Okay, let's do it. Let's make sure this means something." While the legal strategy took shape, the airline was scrambling. Their CEO, a man named Thomas Brennan, who had spent 30 years in the industry, called an emergency board meeting. The optics were terrible. The public relations nightmare was growing by the hour. Advertisers were getting nervous. Shareholders were demanding answers. Thomas sat at the head of the conference table, his tie loosened, his face drawn with stress. "How did we let this happen?" he asked, his voice tight with frustration. "How did we not catch this before it became a national incident?" Karen Delgado, the terminal manager, was on speakerphone, her voice shaky as she tried to explain. It was a routine security check. The staff followed protocol. There was no intent to discriminate. Thomas slammed his hand on the table. "Intent does not matter. Impact matters. And the impact is that we are being dragged through the mud on every platform, every network, every conversation. We look like villains. And maybe we are." He paused, rubbing his temples. "Get me everything, every detail of what happened, every staff member involved, every policy that was cited, and get me a plan to fix this, not a statement, a plan. Real actionable change. I want it on my desk by tomorrow morning." The team scrambled, interviews were conducted, security footage was reviewed, and what they found was damning. Patricia Mendez, the check-in agent, had a history of complaints. Small things, easily dismissed individually, but together they painted a picture of bias, of selective enforcement, of a pattern that had been ignored for too long. Richard Calloway, the supervisor, had signed off on the detention without reviewing any actual evidence, relying solely on Patricia's word. The system had failed at every level, and now, under the harsh light of public scrutiny, there was no hiding from it. By the next day, the airline issued a new statement. This one was different. No vague promises, no defensive language. It was a full acknowledgement of wrongdoing, a public apology to Laurie Harvey, and a commitment to immediate action. Patricia Mendez and Richard Calloway were suspended pending a full investigation. The airline announced mandatory bias training for all staff, a review of security protocols, and the establishment of an independent oversight committee to handle discrimination complaints. It was more than Steve had expected. But it was not enough. Not yet. Steve called a press conference. He stood in front of a wall of cameras, reporters shouting questions, microphones thrust forward. Laurie stood beside him, her hand in his, her face calm but resolute. Steve spoke with the measured authority of someone who had spent a lifetime in front of cameras, but had never spoken about something this personal, this important. My daughter was wronged. That is a fact. But this is not just about her. This is about every person who has been made to feel like they do not belong. Every person who has been judged not by their character, but by their appearance. The airline has taken steps. Good steps, but we will be watching. We will be holding them accountable, and we will not stop until we see real, lasting change. The questions came fast. Mr. Harvey, are you planning to sue? Steve nodded. We are exploring all legal options. Mr. Harvey, what do you say to people who think this is being blown out of proportion? Steve's expression hardened. I would say walk a mile in our shoes. Experience what it feels like to be treated like a criminal for no reason other than the color of your skin. Then tell me it is blown out of proportion. Laurie, how are you doing? A reporter called out. Laurie stepped forward, her voice steady. I am angry. I am hurt. But I am also hopeful. Because I see people standing up. I see people refusing to accept this as normal. And that gives me hope that things can change. The press conference ended, but the conversation continued. Online, in living rooms, in workplaces, people were talking. Some were defensive, uncomfortable with the confrontation of their own biases, but many were listening, learning, recognizing the patterns they had overlooked, the injustices they had dismissed. Change is never easy. It is never comfortable, but it is always necessary. And in that moment, sparked by one woman's experience and amplified by a father's love, change was beginning to take root. That evening, Steve and Laurie sat on the back patio of his home, the Los Angeles skyline glittering in the distance. The air was cool, the night quiet, except for the occasional sound of a car passing on the street below. Laurie looked at her father, really looked at him, and saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight he carried not just for her but for everyone who had ever needed someone to stand up for them. Thank you, she said softly, for everything, for being here, for not letting them get away with it. Steve smiled, a tired but genuine smile. Baby, you never have to thank me for loving you. That is not something you earn. That is something you are born with. You are my daughter, and I will always, always fight for you. They sat in silence for a while, the city lights twinkling like stars, the world spinning on, indifferent and beautiful and broken and full of possibility. And in that silence, there was peace. Not the peace of resolution, because the fight was far from over, but the peace of knowing they were not alone, that they had each other, and that sometimes that is enough to change the world. 3 weeks passed, and the world had not forgotten. That was the surprising part. Usually stories like this burned bright and fast, dominating headlines for a few days before being replaced by the next crisis, the next scandal, the next tragedy. But this one lingered. It lingered because Steve refused to let it fade. It lingered because Laurie found her voice and used it. It lingered because people saw themselves in her story, saw their mothers, their daughters, their sisters, and they refused to look away. The airline had followed through on some of its promises. Patricia Mendez was terminated after the internal investigation confirmed a pattern of discriminatory behavior spanning 3 years. Richard Calloway was demoted and required to complete extensive retraining before he could return to any supervisory role. The mandatory bias training was rolled out across all hubs, though critics questioned whether a few hours of training could undo years of ingrained prejudice. The Independent Oversight Committee was established, chaired by a former civil rights attorney named Marcus Webb, a man with a reputation for not backing down and not accepting empty gestures. Steve met with Marcus twice during those 3 weeks. The first meeting was tense, both men sizing each other up, testing whether this was genuine reform or performative damage control. Marcus had seen too many corporations promise change, only to quietly return to business as usual once the cameras turned away. But Steve was not interested in performances. He wanted results. He wanted data. He wanted to see complaint numbers, resolution rates, demographic breakdowns of who was being stopped, questioned, detained. Marcus appreciated that. He appreciated dealing with someone who understood that real change required real work, not just press releases and photo opportunities. The second meeting was different. Marcus came prepared with preliminary findings, 6 months of data that the airline had been reluctant to release, but could no longer hide. The numbers were damning. Black and Latino passengers were 3 times more likely to be subjected to additional screening than white passengers, even when controlling for destination, ticket class, and booking patterns. Complaints of discriminatory treatment had increased 40% over the past 2 years, but resolution rates had actually decreased. The system was not just broken. It was designed to fail the people who needed it most. Steve sat across from Marcus in a conference room at his production company's offices, the data spread out between them like evidence at a trial. "This is worse than I thought," Steve said, his voice low. Marcus nodded. "It usually is. Most people do not want to believe it is this bad. They want to think it is a few bad apples, a few isolated incidents, but the data does not lie. This is systemic. This is institutional, and it is going to take more than firing 2 people to fix it." Steve leaned back in his chair, his mind already working through possibilities. "What do you need? Resources? Pressure?" "Both." Marcus smiled slightly. "Both. Always both. But what I really need is for you to keep doing what you are doing. Keep talking about it. Keep making it impossible to ignore. Because the moment people stop paying attention, the moment the pressure eases, that is when the real work stops. That is when they go back to protecting their bottom line instead of protecting their passengers." Steve nodded. "I'm not going anywhere. Neither is Laurie. We are in this for the long haul." Marcus extended his hand across the table. "Then we might actually have a chance." While Steve worked behind the scenes, Laurie was finding her own path forward. She had always been private, carefully curating what she shared with the world, protecting her peace in an industry that demanded constant exposure. But this experience had changed something in her. She realized that her platform, her visibility, could be more than just fashion and lifestyle content. It could be a tool for change. She started speaking out, not just about her own experience, but about the broader issues of racial profiling, of discrimination, of the everyday indignities that people of color faced in spaces where they were supposed to be safe. She did an interview with a major news network, sitting across from a veteran journalist who asked the hard questions. "Do you think you would have been treated differently if you were not Steve Harvey's daughter?" Laurie did not hesitate. "Absolutely. And that is the problem. I had resources. I had someone who could fight for me. But what about the people who do not? What about the single mother traveling with her kids who gets pulled aside and humiliated and has no recourse? What about the college student who misses an important interview because security decided he looked suspicious? Those are the people I am thinking about. Those are the people this needs to change for." The interview went viral, not because of drama or conflict, but because of Laurie's authenticity, her refusal to minimize what had happened, her insistence on connecting her experience to something larger. Young women reached out to her by the thousands, sharing their stories, thanking her for speaking up, telling her that they felt seen for the first time. Laurie read as many as she could, her heart breaking and swelling in equal measure. She had not asked for this role, but she was not going to run from it either. She also started working with organizations that fought against racial profiling and discrimination in travel and public spaces. She attended meetings, listened to activists who had been doing this work for decades, learned about the history of these issues, the legal frameworks, the strategies that worked and the ones that did not. She was not content to just be a spokesperson. She wanted to be informed, effective, useful. She wanted to honor the trust that people were placing in her by doing the work, not just talking about it. One afternoon, she visited a community center in South Los Angeles, a neighborhood where many families could not afford the lawyers and publicists that had helped her. She sat in a circle with a group of teenagers, listening as they shared their own experiences of being profiled, of being followed in stores, of being stopped by police for no reason, of being made to feel like they were guilty until proven innocent. One girl, no more than 16, talked about being detained at a mall for suspected shoplifting, even though she had receipts for everything in her bag. The security guard had not apologized, had not even acknowledged that he was wrong. He had just told her she was free to go, as if that erased the humiliation, the fear, the anger. Laurie listened, her eyes stinging with tears. She refused to let fall in front of these kids who were being so brave, so honest. When it was her turn to speak, she did not offer empty platitudes. She did not tell them it would get better or that the world was fair. She told them the truth. This is not okay. What happened to you is not okay. And I am sorry that you have to deal with this, but I also want you to know that you are not alone, that there are people fighting for you, and that your voice matters, your story matters. Do not let anyone make you feel like it does not. After the session, one of the community center organizers, a woman named Shanice, who had been running youth programs for 15 years, pulled Laurie aside. Thank you for coming, for listening. A lot of people in your position would not take the time. Laurie shook her head. I should be thanking them. They reminded me why this matters, why we cannot stop. Shanice smiled. You are going to do good things. I can tell. Just do not forget where you came from. Do not forget the people who do not have cameras following them. Laurie promised she would not, and she meant it. Back at the airline, the changes were slow but real. New training programs were implemented. Not the generic diversity seminars that employees sat through half asleep, but intensive scenario-based training that forced staff to confront their biases, to recognize the patterns they had been unconsciously perpetuating. It was uncomfortable. Some employees resisted, complained that they were being unfairly targeted, that they were just doing their jobs, but others embraced it, grateful for the tools to do better, to be better. The Oversight Committee began reviewing complaints in real time, flagging patterns, holding managers accountable. For the first time, there were consequences for discriminatory behavior that went beyond a slap on the wrist. Employees who repeatedly violated policies were removed. Managers who ignored complaints were demoted. The culture was shifting, slowly, painfully, but undeniably. It was not perfect. There were still incidents, still complaints, still moments when the old patterns reasserted themselves, but there was also accountability. There was transparency. There was a recognition that this was not just about avoiding lawsuits or bad press. This was about treating people with dignity. Steve received regular updates from Marcus, and he shared them with Laurie over dinners at his house, the two of them poring over reports and data like generals planning a campaign. They celebrated the victories, small as they sometimes were. A policy change here, a successful complaint resolution there, a staff member who spoke up when they saw something wrong, but they also acknowledged the setbacks, the resistance, the long road still ahead. Change is not a moment, Steve told Laurie one evening as they sat on the patio, the sun setting in shades of pink and gold. It is a process, and processes take time, but that does not mean we stop. It means we keep going. Laurie looked at her father, this man who had built an empire on hard work and resilience, who had faced his own share of discrimination and doubt and had refused to let it define him. She realized that this was his legacy, not the shows or the books or the fame, but this, the willingness to stand up, the refusal to accept injustice, the commitment to making the world better for the people who came after him. And she realized that it was her legacy too, that she had a choice in how she responded to what had happened, in whether she let it break her or build her. She chose to build. As the weeks turned into a month, the story began to shift from outrage to action, from what had happened to what was being done about it. Other airlines took notice, some implementing their own reforms, others doubling down on defensive postures that only made them look worse by comparison. Advocacy groups used Laurie's case as a rallying point, pushing for broader legislation, for federal oversight, for accountability measures that could not be quietly dismantled when public attention moved on. The conversation had expanded beyond one incident, beyond one family, into a national reckoning with how people of color were treated in spaces that were supposed to serve everyone equally. And through it all, Steve and Laurie stood together, not as celebrities seeking attention, but as father and daughter refusing to be silent, refusing to accept that this was just the way things were. They had turned pain into purpose, humiliation into advocacy, and in doing so, they had given countless others permission to do the same. The fight was not over. It would probably never be fully over. But they had proven that it was possible to fight back, to demand better, to create change. And that was something worth holding on to. 6 months after the incident at LAX, Lori Harvey stood in front of a crowd of over 2,000 people at a civil rights conference in Atlanta. The venue was packed, every seat filled, people standing along the walls, the energy in the room electric with anticipation. She had been invited to speak about her experience, about the work that had followed, about what it meant to turn a moment of injustice into a movement for change. She was nervous, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the edges of the podium. But when she looked out at the sea of faces, young and old, black and brown and white, all looking at her with expectation and hope, she felt something shift inside her. This was bigger than her fear. This was bigger than her comfort. This was about every person in this room and the millions beyond it who needed to know that their voices mattered. She began to speak, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. 6 months ago, I was detained at an airport for no reason other than someone decided I did not look like I belonged. I was humiliated. I was angry. I was scared. But I was also lucky. Lucky because I had a father who could fight for me. Lucky because I had resources and a platform. But luck should not determine whether you are treated with dignity. Dignity should be a right, not a privilege. The crowd erupted in applause and Lori felt tears prick her eyes. But she pushed through, determined to finish what she had started. She talked about the work that had been done, the policy changes, the oversight committees, the training programs. She talked about the data that Marcus Webb had uncovered, the systemic nature of the problem, the long road still ahead. But she also talked about hope, about the teenagers she had met in South Los Angeles who were finding their voices, about the airline employees who had reached out to her privately, thanking her for forcing a conversation they had been too afraid to start themselves, about the other passengers who had come forward with their own stories, no longer willing to suffer in silence. Change is happening, she said, her voice rising with conviction. It is slow, it is hard, but it is happening. And it is happening because people like you refuse to accept that this is just the way things are. When she finished, the standing ovation lasted nearly 5 minutes. People were crying, cheering, holding up signs with her name and messages of support. Lori stepped back from the podium, overwhelmed, and found her father waiting in the wings. He pulled her into a hug, whispering in her ear, "I am so proud of you, you have no idea how proud." She held on to him, drawing strength from his presence, from the knowledge that no matter what happened next, she was not alone in this fight. After the conference, Lori and Steve flew back to Los Angeles together. On the plane, they sat side by side in first class, the irony not lost on either of them. The flight attendants were professional, courteous, going out of their way to make sure they were comfortable. Lori wondered if it was because they recognized who she was, or if it was because the airline industry as a whole had gotten the message. Either way, she was grateful for the peace, for the ability to travel without fear, without the constant vigilance that had become second nature. Steve pulled out his laptop, reviewing notes for an upcoming project, but Lori could tell his mind was elsewhere. "Dad," she said softly, "do you think we actually made a difference? Or is this just going to fade away like everything else?" Steve closed his laptop and turned to face her fully. "Baby, I have been in this industry for over 30 years. I have seen a lot of things come and go, but I have also seen real change happen when people refuse to give up. And that is what we did. We refused to give up. We refused to let them sweep this under the rug. Did we solve everything? No. But we moved the needle, and that matters." Lori nodded, wanting to believe him, needing to believe him. She looked out the window at the clouds below, vast and white and endless, and thought about all the people who were still fighting, still struggling, still waiting for the world to see them as fully human. She thought about the girl at the mall, the teenagers at the community center, the countless others whose stories would never make headlines, but were no less important, no less deserving of justice. She made a silent promise to keep fighting for them, to use whatever platform she had to amplify their voices, to never forget that her privilege came with responsibility. When they landed in Los Angeles, there was a small group of reporters waiting, as there often was now. Steve handled most of the questions with his usual charm and directness, but when one reporter asked Lori what was next for her, She paused, considering her answer carefully. What is next is continuing the work. This was never about one incident or one airline. This is about changing the culture, changing the systems that allow discrimination to thrive. So I am going to keep speaking out. I am going to keep working with organizations that are on the front lines of this fight. And I am going to keep holding people accountable, because that is what it takes. The months that followed were a blur of activity. Lori partnered with several civil rights organizations, using her platform to raise awareness and funds. She testified before a congressional committee examining discrimination in the travel industry, her testimony powerful and personal, bringing several lawmakers to tears. Legislation was introduced, not comprehensive enough to solve everything, but a start, a foundation that could be built upon. Steve used his connections in the entertainment industry to organize a benefit concert, raising over $5 million for legal defense funds and advocacy groups. Celebrities who had remained silent before suddenly found their voices, adding their support to the cause. The airline continued its reforms, though not without resistance. There were internal battles, pushback from employees who felt unfairly targeted, complaints from passengers who resented the increased scrutiny on their own behavior. But Marcus Webb and his oversight committee held firm, refusing to compromise on the principles they had established. Slowly, the culture began to shift. Complaints of discriminatory treatment decreased by 30% in the first year. Passenger satisfaction scores among people of color increased. It was not perfect, but it was progress. And progress, however incremental, was worth fighting for. 1 year after the incident, Lori received a letter. It was handwritten, the penmanship careful and deliberate, from a young woman named Jasmine, who had been detained at an airport in Texas under similar circumstances. She wrote about how she had seen Lori's story, how it had given her the courage to file a complaint, to demand accountability, to refuse to accept that what had happened to her was acceptable. Because of you, she wrote, I did not stay silent. Because of you, I knew I deserved better. Thank you for showing me that my voice matters. Lori read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face, and she realized that this right here, was why it had all been worth it. Not the headlines or the accolades or the policy changes, though those mattered, but this. The knowledge that somewhere out there, a young woman she had never met felt empowered to stand up for herself. That was the real victory. That was the legacy she wanted to build. She showed the letter to Steve that evening over dinner. He read it slowly, his expression softening, and when he looked up at her, there was pride in his eyes, but also something deeper. Gratitude. Relief. The knowledge that his daughter had not just survived what had happened to her, but had transformed it into something meaningful, something that would outlast the pain. You did that, he said simply. You gave her hope. And hope is the most powerful thing we have. As the second year approached, the story faded from the daily news cycle, as stories inevitably do. But the work continued. The oversight committee remained active. The training programs were refined and expanded. Other industries began to take notice, implementing their own reforms, recognizing that discrimination was not just a moral failing, but a business liability. The conversation had shifted. Not completely, not universally, but enough that people could no longer pretend the problem did not exist. Lori continued to speak, to advocate, to show up for the communities that had supported her. She used her platform not just to talk about what had happened to her, but to elevate the voices of others, to share their stories, to remind the world that injustice was not an isolated incident, but a daily reality for millions. She became more than a model or an influencer. She became an advocate, a voice for the voiceless, a reminder that privilege carried responsibility and that silence in the face of injustice was complicity. Steve watched his daughter grow into this role with a mixture of pride and awe. He had always known she was strong, but he had not fully understood the depth of her courage until he saw her stand in front of crowds, in front of cameras, in front of powerful people who did not want to hear what she had to say and speak her truth anyway. She had taken the worst moment of her life and turned it into a catalyst for change. That took a kind of strength that could not be taught, only lived. On the 2-year anniversary of the incident, Laurie and Steve returned to LAX together. Not for a flight, but for a ceremony. The airline, in partnership with Marcus Webb's Oversight Committee, was unveiling a new passenger Bill of Rights, prominently displayed in every terminal, outlining the protections and recourse available to anyone who felt they had been discriminated against. It was a symbolic gesture, but symbols mattered. They set expectations. They created accountability. They reminded everyone who walked through those doors that dignity was not negotiable. Laurie stood in front of the display, reading the words that had been fought for, negotiated, refined through countless meetings and debates. She thought about the girl she had been 2 years ago, standing at a check-in counter, unaware that her life was about to change. She thought about the fear, the anger, the humiliation, but she also thought about everything that had come after. The strength she had discovered, the community she had found, the difference she had made. And she realized that while she would never be grateful for what had happened, she was grateful for who she had become because of it. Steve stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder, and together they looked at the display, at the people walking past, at the world that was slowly, painfully, beautifully changing. "This is not the end," he said quietly. "This is just the beginning." Laurie nodded. "I know, and I am ready." They walked out of the terminal together, father and daughter, into the bright California sunshine, ready for whatever came next, knowing that as long as they had each other, as long as they had their voices and their courage and their refusal to accept injustice, they could face anything. The fight for dignity, for equality, for justice is never truly over. It is a continuous effort, a daily choice to stand up, to speak out, to refuse to be silent. Laurie Harvey and Steve Harvey had made that choice, and in doing so, they had inspired countless others to make it too. That was their legacy, not perfection, but persistence, not victory, but the refusal to surrender. And in a world that often felt overwhelming, that often felt like it was moving backward instead of forward, that refusal was everything. Hey, my friends, help me by subscribing to the channel so we can reach 1,000 subscribers, even if you are watching from your TV or computer. Your subscription makes all the difference, and the algorithm will help you see more amazing stories. Leave a like or an emoji in the comments and be part of this growth.